Didn't they do a great job? They did a great job. And the most amazing thing is they have the same birthday. I just think. That's cool. As I was thinking about the sermon and the text today, an old preacher story came to mind of a gentleman who's walking along the beach. His name is Jim, and he's walking along like many of you do, probably meditating, thinking, perhaps godly things, theological faith questions. And, he's just wondering about the big God issue. And he stops and he looks at the sun setting, and it just kind of bursts out of him. He says, "God, are you there?" And to his amazement, a voice says, "Yes, John, I am. What would you like to know? What can I do for you?" Well, John, thinking that this was his one big opportunity, he immediately thought of big questions that he would ask God. He's saying, "God, how long is a million years in your world, in the infinite? How long is a million years?" And God's voice replies, "John, a million years is like a minute where I am." And John goes, "Wow." And not to miss a step, he says, "Well, how much is $1 million in your world?" And God says, "John, $1 million in my world is like 1 penny." John says, "Wow." And recognizing God's benevolence and generosity, he says, "God, would you mind giving me one of those pennies?" And God, being the gracious God that God is, said, "Sure, John, just wait a minute." Now, we chuckle and laugh at that story, but there really is a deeper and significant point. And it is that we immediately jump to these huge and humongous questions, these infinite things that just baffle our minds and go beyond us. And we want these small, finite answers. And God, in so many ways, says, take a step or two back. It's amazing. You read the book of Job. Any of you read Job? It's about the question of why and suffering. And if you get all the way to the end of that text, God simply says to Job, "Were you there when I created the world?" Take that. Kind of recognize your place and your skills and abilities. Nonetheless, we jump to those big things, which is why when we hear the text, especially out of the Gospel of Mark, what fascinates us and what we begin to look at and what many preachers and authors make a pretty good living giving to folks is the stuff about the moon turning blood red and the stars falling from the sky and just this cataclysmic, disastrous, catastrophic ending to the world. And we want to know the when, the why, the how, the what, the where. That's where we focus. That's where we go. And our world helps us to go there. The news is a proponent of that every evening. That's where they try to catapult us. Mentally and emotionally. When in truth, it's way beyond us. Even Jesus says, "Of that day and that hour, neither the angels nor I know." Even Jesus says there's something else. And don't get me wrong, I believe that history is linear, not cyclical in nature. There's a beginning and there's an end, and even science backs that up. Science says that at this very moment there are universes being born and that ours is dying out, that someday this universe will go dark. I know that. It's just that I don't dwell on that. Do you? I don't dwell on that fact. I don't focus on that because I think there are other things that are more important. There are other things that are a bigger deal. There are other things that I really can get a handle on and make a difference with. And that is not one of them. This is what Jesus does in this text. Notice how Jesus talks in Mark. He says about the end, and he talks about, the world is going to come to an end, and certainly in his time, as he sees the Romans coming down and eventually what will happen, that's a pretty good prediction. Certainly their world came to an end. But that's not where Jesus goes. Jesus moves from the big and the catchy and the sensational. He brings it all the way back to the manageable, the day-to-day, the specific things. And he says, but what about what you do and who you are today? And remember, leading up to this, parable after parable after parable, it's about being prepared. It's about being ready. It's about taking care of this moment. Because if you take care of today, what does tomorrow do? It takes care of itself. And Jesus says that. You know, in the parable of the 10 bridesmaids, 5 kept their lamps full of oil, 5 didn't. Be prepared. The parable of the talents. Some of them buried them, some of them didn't. Do what you can now. Jesus moves away from that and says, don't worry about all the things that are out of your control, that are really under God's control. Come back to the things that you can manage, that are under your control, that you are accountable and responsible for. So Jesus' warning in the Gospel of Mark is not so much about some things we can't predict or wrap our minds around. It is about today, this day, the here and now, and what we can do in our world, our part of the world that truly matters. You know, like most of you, I suspect, Monday evening I was watching the news, waiting for the announcement on the grand jury hearing in Ferguson, Missouri. And, you know, I had my thoughts about where it might go, where it might not go, and so forth and so on. But what I began to realize as I was watching the news is how they were preparing me and gearing me and literally raising my blood pressure up to expect the worst. That's where they were focusing on. And of course, you know, I think we're really good at self-fulfilling prophecies. I think we do a good job of projecting that and raising that up. And then when it happens, we love to say, oh, it's going to get worse, or it's even going to happen more, and that's where we like to go. We look at that explosive ending. And yet I was thinking, you know, during the time when I'm actually looking towards that, expecting that, whether it happens or not, in the meantime, there are people working behind the scene to avoid it. There are people trying, you know, there are ministers, there are clergy, there are lay people, there are social workers. There's all kinds of people behind the scenes, not trying to gather the front headlines, but they're trying to do what they need to do to calm it down, to make things right and just and peaceful. But we don't see that. We don't hear that. We don't focus on that. And our energy then goes in directions that is non-productive. Our media is probably one of the most powerful creations ever. It's just a shame that it tends to focus so much on the sensational, overlooking the hopeful and the ideal. But you know why they go there? Because it works. It works. And so the big comes back to the little. It comes back to us. Yeah, like I said, oftentimes I think we're our own worst enemies. We are the creators of self-fulfilling prophecies. We become negative Nancys, as we, no offense to anyone named Nancy, we become negative individuals as we look ahead, always expecting the other shoe to drop, always when so much of that is beyond us, it's out of our control. We can't do anything about that. I can only do about what I can do about. And Jesus says, take care of today. Do what you need to do and are called to do today. Take care of your neighbor. Breed peace and harmony in your neighborhood. Resist just throwing up your hands in despair. There are enough hopeless people. There are enough negative talking heads. We may not be able to change the world, but we have the power to change the part of the world that is ours. And if more people did that, it could be infectious and the whole world could be different. You know, Advent reminds us of that. The season of Advent reminds us of that because Advent is that time when good news is spoke under hopeless conditions, under questionable times. The people of Israel have lost their homeland. They've had their temple and their capital destroyed, and they're saying, what's going to happen? Where is this? How is God doing anything in this craziness around us? Advent says we are to wait and listen and rediscover God in what is a foreign land, uncomfortable times and places, places of loss in our cultural, our world, even our personal lives. Be still and know that I am God. Advent is about the best in us, the best of us, our highest ideals, at times when the world would laugh and scoff at those ideals. You know, I was watching the news. I think it might have been on the Huffington Post Live online, and there was a woman being interviewed. She and her husband started this big orphanage program in Darfur. You don't hear much about Darfur anymore, but you know that there's parts of the world we care about, I suspect because of economics, and other parts of the world we don't care about so much. But she and her husband started an orphanage there, and they were interviewing her. She was going back. She was going back because she believed so much in, she said, you know, those people, not those people, that's a wrong term to use, the people, the indigenous people who live there can't change if they don't meet face to face someone else who's different. All they do is hear about someone else. And she said, it's so important I go back there. And it was very significant because it had taken her a long time to recover, because at one time, a while back, she had drifted too far in her Jeep visiting villages and had been captured and beaten and raped. And yet, she said, I must go back because things don't change if I'm not a part of that. Advent is about working for peace most fervently when all people talk about is war. Believing that no matter what neighbors or politicians or analysts or the media say, that in the end God will win if we faithfully labor today. I think one of the words that I think, at least for me, caused me the most problems theologically was the word omnipotent. People interpret the word omnipotent, God is omnipotent, is that God micromanages every little thing. I got to tell you, if God micromanages what I eat for lunch, there are more important things God should be about. And there are just too many questions in that kind of theology as to why this happens and that happens and so forth. So in my theology, in my interpretation, the word omnipotent does not mean God micromanages every detail. It means that in the end of time, at the end of history, God will win. That God wins the day, that good will triumph over evil, that death does not have power over us, that the resurrection is the ultimate good, and that life goes on forever. Those are the things that motivate me, that drive me forward. Even though I may not live to that day, I have a part in making it happen. Let us never forget those uplifting words that someone wrote that said, you know, when the night comes, the stars come out. A few years back, Charles Gould, he was the publisher of the San Francisco Examiner. He came up with a list of some positive aspects of life. Unfortunately, the list never really received any headlines in that newspaper, and some of the numbers are dated at this time, but I reflected on it, and I thought it was an important thing to pass on to you and for you to take home with you today. He wrote at that time, he said, I want you to know that this year, 196 million people will not be arrested. That 115 million individuals will maintain a formal religious connection. That 75 million citizens and corporations will pay $160 billion or more in income taxes. That more than 4 million teachers, pastors, professional people will not participate in a strike or a riotous behavior. That 75% of all young adults these days donate to charity, and 63% of them donate and give their time. We need to focus and remember these things. They are the good things. They are the behind-the-scene things. They are not the headline things, but they are the God things. So though the world will end someday, even science affirms this fact, I want to say that is not what I choose to focus on. Because I think that's not really where Jesus spent most of his time. I do not choose to waste my time and energy with things I cannot fully comprehend nor wrap my mental arms around, but rather I would spend my time and my energy and my thought power on trying to determine what I am called to do today, what we are called to do today. And to do that alongside with countless other thousands of nameless, committed individuals who do not look for notoriety or recognition or even thanks. They just look to do good and to share God. And just imagine how different the world might look if more people thought and acted this way today. Amen.